Hello, and welcome to the Unsung Cyberhero Adventures Internet TV Network. I'm your host, Gary Berman. Our mission is to shine a light on the people and organizations who keep us safe online while at work, home, and school, and to serve as a networking platform for the cybersecurity and information technology community. We've learned that 62% of human communications is nonverbal. That's why we include a video feed, so that you have the option of seeing our guests or simply to just listen. That's also why we're called a network, because we're all about promoting information sharing and business-to-business networking. Our strategic plan is to be a force multiplier by introducing people and organizations to one another and to our audience based upon the principle that a rising tide lifts all ships. On today's show, we're fortunate to have two amazing thought leaders who will share their experiences and perspectives on one of the most insidious, dangerous, and destructive cyber crimes that continue to haunt every person who is online from birth to death: identity theft. Adam Levin is the chairman and founder of CyberScout and co-founder of Credit.com. Now in its 17th year, CyberScout has become one of the largest identity theft education, resolution, identity management, and data breach response companies in the world. It has a client base of 700 institutions and 800,000 small businesses. On an enrollment basis, CyberScout is the identity theft service provider for 10% of the households in the United States, covering over 45 million people who participate in one or more of its resolution, life stage management, or breach response programs. Bob Sullivan is a veteran journalist and the author of 5 books, including New York Times bestsellers Gotcha Capitalism and Stop Getting Ripped Off. He's won the Society of Professional Journalists Public Service Award, a Peabody Award, and the Consumer Federation of America Betty Furness Consumer Media Service Award. He spent nearly 2 decades working at MSNBC.com and NBC News, and he still appears on Today, NBC Nightly News, and many other shows. He's now a syndicated columnist and frequent TV guest. He's also co-host of the podcast audio documentary Breach, which examines history's biggest hacking stories, and co-host of the weekly podcast So Bob, which tackles stories about the unintended consequences of technology. His newest book, The Barstool MBA, Why Running a Bar Beats Running to Business School, was published in July 2019. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you.
Adam, let me begin with you. And as you know, my background is the superhero digital comic universe. So if you'll allow me, I want to use a phrase that's very common to it. Tell us your origin story.
Well, my origin story really is that I spent time in public service. I was Consumer Affairs Director for the state of New Jersey. I started Credit.com in 1993. We went online in 94, so we were one of the original .com companies, and Credit.com is still with us, which is quite a statement in light of all the iterations that so many companies have gone through and failures that companies have experienced. We started, first it was known as Identity Theft 911 in 2003, with a core competence in identity theft resolution, because we felt that, unfortunately, many people who were getting into the identity theft space, it was more viewed as a additional revenue channel as opposed to something that was the core of an organization. We then morphed into IDT 911, and that's because the name Identity Theft 911 terrified so many people. And then after a few years at IDT 911, we suddenly realized that people were saying, well, you an alarm company or a phone company? And because we were going global at that time, because we're now in the US, Canada, the EU, Asia, Malaysia, and Australia, many people saw 911 as September 11th. They didn't see it as an emergency phone number. And also because we were morphing also towards software as service, in addition to our core services, which are one-on-one resolution services, we felt that CyberScout really captured more of the technology orientation of the company.
Well, let me just ask you about the notion of 911. I mean, so identity theft is really not an emergent issue. As you stated, it's been here for a long time, yet it still, has a sense of urgency about it because the damages are so devastating. Why is it still such a problem in your view?
Well, first of all, we're living in a world where breaches have become the third certainty in life behind death and taxes. Uh, Combine that with the outrageous amount of oversharing that people tend to do on social media, and then add in the just shocking amount of phishing attacks that are going on. I mean, just as an example, it recently a report came out that said that COVID-related phishing attacks have increased by over 30,000% since January.
Wow.
And again, when you're dealing with hackers, you're dealing with people who are creative, sophisticated, and they will leap upon any perceived advantage. And they thrive on chaos. And if you think about the environment, with the COVID disaster going on, you have an economic disaster, you have a health disaster, and you have the majority of people on this planet focused on one subject, which is COVID-19. So anything that anyone may say, whether it's in connection with taxes, healthcare, unemployment, or any of the whole series of issues that we face, the minute they inject the words COVID-19, everybody's paying attention while they're working from home, homeschooling, trying to juggle family, and getting on with their lives. That's our day job. But to a hacker, we are all their day job.
It's interesting because I'm here in South Florida and there happens to be a very large thunderstorm. So I'm not sure if our listeners can pick up on it, but it's kind of this impending thunderstorm and lightning, and it's almost this perfect storm, isn't it, Bob? We just listened to what Adam just shared about this confluence of life itself, and life and death consequences. I mean, how do you cover something like this? How do you think about something like this from your experience, as a journalist?
Perfect storm is a metaphor that's overused, but I really do think that's right for this situation. I spent my morning on the phone with a company named Agari, who has been watching a Nigerian crime ring, and they understand how they've operated for almost a decade. But they were on the forefront of this wild scam involving unemployment insurance, which probably a lot of folks have heard about by now. The state of Washington had to actually stop its unemployment program because there was so much fraud involved. They just announced the other day that might be hundreds of millions of dollars that have been stolen. And this crime ring has actually been training for about 10 years for this very moment. It started off doing simple Craigslist scams and worked its way up to business email compromise, something I like to call CEO identity theft. Somebody just writes to your CFO and says, I'm the CEO, I'm Adam Levin, send money right now because I just did a deal. And they created this network of money mules that involves sweetheart scams, almost every scam that you could think of. So when the money started flowing, when the population got scared, and when all of those government offices were overwhelmed with unemployment requests, well, this was the perfect storm for this crime group. And right now, that's what we're seeing. So, but I think the real primary thing that we haven't gotten around is we still don't know how to tell who people are when they're online. And as a result, it's really easy for you to be someone else or someone else to be you. And computers can't tell the difference between a bunch of ones and zeros and a copy of a bunch of ones and zeros. And that's why we keep getting here.
From your perch, beginning as a journalist, you migrated into, technology very early on. And then as a consequence of cybersecurity and identity theft. I mean, what do you think what do we have to do next now to protect ourselves, to somehow be able to get these ones and zeros, to be able to tell who's who?
Well, the answer to almost all of these problems is to slow down. One of the reasons, I used to joke, was only half kidding. I wrote a book called Your Evil Twin. It's one of the first books about identity theft. And I described identity theft as a marketing plan. You could go into an electronics store and walk out with a $4,000 television by just signing your name to something. So easy credit, instant credit is really the grist of the mill for identity theft. And we haven't still moved past that. And the situation we're in right now with COVID, We're trying to get benefits to people as quickly as we can. And it's that speed, which is the enemy of the folks who are trying to stop crime. The quicker people are, the more urgency there is to a situation, the easier it is to perpetuate a crime. So slowing down is the answer. Unfortunately, right now the planet is doing the opposite of slowing down, right? Everywhere you turn, we just want things faster and quicker and more immediate.
You know, it's interesting that you use the word planet. Again, you know, I think in terms of comics and the digital universe itself. Adam, you mentioned now that, you know, you're global and you're in multiple different countries. How did you decide what countries to expand your business into?
Well, Canada made a lot of sense because it's on the continent and because we share a lot of things in common with the Canadians in terms of credit systems. They're a little different, but still somewhat similar to us. And then the next stop was the EU because certainly there they've experienced a lot of issues with identity theft. The only difference between the EU and the United States is that up until recently, nobody was reporting breaches in the EU because they didn't have the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. In the US, of course, we have another problem, which Bob and I have confronted often, which is there's no national breach notification law in the US. There are literally 52 separate jurisdictions between territories and states that have different breach notification laws. Some are much tougher than others. Some are confusing. Some have way different sets of rules in terms of notification. So it was a logical expansion for us north and then east and then just continuing to go east. And, you know, we do a lot of breach notification and breach response work in Asia and Australia and Malaysia.
You know, one of the interesting things about the General Data Protection Regulations, GDPR, is, and I think this might be an unintended consequence, you know, Bob, maybe you can offer your opinion, that they stop using who is to make it even more difficult to identify, you know, who people are online. I mean, what am I missing here?
Well, it depends on what side of that equation you're on. I have a bunch of websites, and it's really annoying when people can find me and spam me and use my website registration against me. So, I mean, who is sort of like a Secretary of State's business license registry, right? So if you want to find somebody who's a bad actor, who is helps. But you're right. It's in some ways a lot easier to be anonymous online right now. And anonymity online is a double-edged sword. It's what has led to so many of these great moments of free speech. It's what's led to the Twitter revolution. It's what's led to a lot of people feeling free to find groups or find people who were like them that they wouldn't otherwise. But anonymity has a very dark side, and that's what we are all talking about right now.
You know, and speaking of anonymity, now with COVID tracking and using cell phone data, you know, Adam, what's your take on all that? How can the planet somehow reconcile these two competing interests of needing to know where everyone is and privacy, data privacy?
Well, no, this is a huge issue, and it's got an awful lot of people unsettled. But at the same point, we have to do tracing. We have to kind of get a better idea of where people are and how this thing is spreading. But at the same point, there is an ongoing and very serious debate about limitations on it so it doesn't get completely out of hand. And one thing we know with government and certainly with corporations as well, any potential piece of data that you make available to them, they will find a way to use and spread. And I mean, think about the fact that also at this moment, there are, I think, Bob, over 20 billion Internet of Things, maybe as much as 26 billion Internet of Things devices, eavesdropping, tracking, sending information back to who knows where. Most, if not all, vulnerable to hacking because most, if not all, are still using manufacturer default passwords that people don't change or customize. And, you know, there's a movement afoot, for instance, that to make manufacturers of Internet of Things devices not allow them to connect and work unless consumers add customized passwords and these devices are capable of updating.
If I could just jump in there on that, something I feel really strongly about. I just finished a 6-part series called No Place to Hide on privacy. And what it was really about, Adam mentioned there's not a national data breach disclosure law. There's not a national privacy law really either in America. And as a result, data is forever. So when a company or a government collects something about us, they keep it forever. And that's really the problems. There's no guardrails on any of this data. I am all for using whatever technology we can to help us stay safe and to figure out COVID. It's a global crisis. However, there's two problems. One is, when does it end? And we have no way of regulating that. But the bigger problem for me is, even with so many of these technologies, there's a lot of snake oil. And so far, this contact tracing technology doesn't even really work. It doesn't even really do what we need it to do. It doesn't really tell you where you've been and whether or not you are at greater risk because you've been someone. If it's Bluetooth enabled. So if someone's in another room, but your phones are close to each other, it'll tell you that you need to be contact traced, for example. So the bad combination of how much of this data will be stored and used about us, used on us, used against us forever, and what are we getting for that surrender of privacy? Those are two questions that are really essential to ask, and we rarely ask them correctly.
And, just to build on something you said earlier, Bob, which is slow down, so speed is not, a good idea right now, yet in terms of the virus itself, timing and speed is everything. How do you reconcile that?
Yeah, that's a great challenge, right? I mean, we're going to see this when it comes to the vaccine. Of course, we want to get a vaccine as soon as we can, but boy, it's scary to think somebody might cut corners to get a vaccine, right? So that's where rules come into play. And that's where, the FDA, for all its flaws, has a really strong set of rules that must be followed, and people can point to them and people can file lawsuits against them. In the world of tech, in the world of privacy, there is nothing of the sort. There is no regime like that. And that's the real problem.
No, in the U.S., we've come at least a little bit closer to GDPR with the California Consumer Protection Act. But we have a long way to go. And again, the other issue is, in the U.S., if we end up with competing data protection laws amongst the states, it could become a nightmare for everyone. So therefore, we really have to give greater thought to this, and we have to get it right.
And who are the decision makers on such an important matter? Who's going to get it right?
Well, Bob and I would shudder to say the United States Congress, and the White House would be part of the answer to people who have to be part of an intelligent discussion. But they also have to be working with privacy experts as well as leadership in the different states, because there are some states that are very aggressive in terms of privacy protection, and there are other states that aren't. So again, this has to be part of a whole concept of collaboration, communication, and cooperation, which is something we really don't have that much of in the U.S., especially when it comes to regulatory schemes. We got to get way better at that.
That's a really good observation, and one of the things that from the listening learning that I've been able to do is the criminals share freely, that you can buy templates. There's the equivalent of a Yelp rating system on how good was your drug delivery. I mean, it's like not believable, except it's true. Yeah,
it costs $50 right now to learn how to commit unemployment fraud against U.S. states, for example.
$50?
Yeah, to buy a kit for that.
And think about all the ransomware attacks and the fact that these guys actually have a customer service line to help people find the Bitcoin and then pay the Bitcoin in order to unfreeze files. And of course, the other problem with ransomware, even if you pay, even though there are a large percentage of these folks that will give you the decryption key, assuming they have it and can figure out how to do it. But the other issue now is, in the old days, there was almost an honor system where you paid, the data was unfrozen, you got access again, and the data wasn't released. But now there is a trend toward not only having people pay to release the data, but then having the bad guys also release the data. There was the case of the plastic surgery operation on the West Coast, where they not only got them to pay to unfreeze the files, they got them to pay to not release the data, and then they went to a lot of the patients of this particular firm and said, what's it worth to you for us not to release before and after pictures of you?
And what happened?
There were people who paid and people who didn't pay, and it's still a continuing saga as to whether this information is going to get released.
You know, in researching more about this, at one point the FBI, their guidance was, to not pay, and one of the points was that the criminals would just use these funds to perpetuate their crimes, and there's no guarantee that they're going to release the encryption key as you both have described. But then recently the guidance has evolved in the last maybe 6 months. It says, well, it depends on each business case. You have to weigh it out. What is the cost of reconstructing your business life, and how long can you be offline? So Bob, what's your view? If you had to pick, if you don't mind, put you on the spot, so you have a binary choice: to pay or not to pay.
Well, I'm a journalist, so I'm not going to do that. But I am going to tell you that while, I mean, my job is to tell you what's happening, not to give you advice. What's happening is, while the FBI advice has been all along not to pay, lots of organizations have paid. It's been going on all along. And in fact, I talked to, at a computer security conference not that long ago, I talked to a woman who gives advice on this, and she now tells corporations to set up a Bitcoin account ahead of time, because often when these demands come in, you have very little time to deal with it. And if, in addition to the forensics happening, you also have to figure out how to get Bitcoin and get a Bitcoin account funded, you're going to run out of time. So it's gotten so bad that companies are actually in advance preparing for how they're going to pay ransomware ransoms. So, I mean, I'll tell you what's happening, which is people are deciding to pay.
Well, and Gary, the other issue too is, just remember, when it comes to ransomware, it's not what your information is worth on the dark web to someone else. It's what is your information worth to you, so you can continue to function. And if you're for instance, I mean, you saw Atlanta and Baltimore, I mean, they each paid, I think, in excess of 20 million to restore their systems. We know there's big healthcare systems that have paid because they couldn't have themselves reduced, and some were, to pencil and paper, and operations were pushed off, and patients' lives were in danger. So it's one of it's a Sophie's choice, and oftentimes a business is going to make the choice to survive and to protect its client base as best as it can, and if that's paying the ransom, they're going to do it.
Well, one of the important tools pertaining to that is risk management and having the tools to survive. Why don't you tell our audience a little bit about cybersecurity insurance and the kinds of things that you do once an organization is breached?
Well, I think, one of the important things to get out of the way too is that if you want to, a wonderful line from the Karate Kid was, best way to defend against a punch is to not be there, right? So the truth is that because we know breaches are a fact of life, and because we know that a lot of organizations have extremely valuable data, in addition to endpoint security and all the different things they should be doing in zero trust environments where you assume the fact that somebody's going to come after you, you have to do things like you have to update your software and firmware whenever it's appropriate to do so. You need to upgrade, especially when you realize that the world is changing so rapidly that when newer, more innovative, and more protective forms of software and firmware are out there, you should be getting it. But then the key thing is back up your data and do it frequently. And don't back it up on something that's connected 24/7 to the internet, because all that's going to happen is if ransomware hits, it's going to go straight through into the backup. So that's why, the cloud has been a wonderful option here. The only problem with the cloud is you have so many organizations that think, oh, the cloud provider is going to take care of me. And the truth is, you have a responsibility as an organization to do whatever necessary to protect your data. Because how many times have we seen stories where millions, if not tens of millions of files have been exposed sitting there in the cloud, not properly protected, and the cloud providers looking at the business saying, well, hey, didn't you read our contract? So, businesses need to do that. They need to practice what I call the 3 M's. How do you minimize your risk of exposure by reducing your attackable surface? Employee training is a critical part of that. Having the most up-to-date software is a critical part of that. Having password protocols is a critical part of that. How do you then monitor effectively so you know you have a problem as quickly as possible? And what's your plan to manage the damage? And so many organizations don't even have breach response plans. And then it's sort of like the fire has started. Oh, golly, we have no fire extinguishers. We have no plan. Let's hope the fire department gets here in time. And with cyber, that's often not the case. So that is a huge problem, and preparedness is the most critical aspect of it. And then training your team to respond as if they're sailors on a nuclear submarine. So the response is literally muscle response, muscle memory.
So just to take the muscle memory metaphor, a step further, large enterprises, and for that matter, small to medium businesses, had, let's say, X amount of muscle memory that they've been developing pertaining to cybersecurity over the past few years. Now, that whole playbook is out the window because of the confluence of people working at home. So, Bob, what's that about? I mean, how do you develop, and I'm going to go back to something you said, pretty quickly, but not too quick, this muscle memory of this whole new planet and a way of working and thinking about cybersecurity.
It's really difficult right now because most cybersecurity software is designed to recognize anomalies. It looks for patterns and it looks for outliers. And so, you've got 100 people on a network and one person coming in from a strange IP address. Let's look into that. And overnight, everything is an anomaly. Everybody is remote working. Everybody is getting email updates. Everyone's using all this new software. I have teacher friends who are being required to learn 8, 9, 10 different platforms. Each one of them has the login. Each one of them has email instructions. And how many years have we been telling people, don't click on emails, just avoid clicking on emails altogether. But now I couldn't have entered this Zoom meeting if I didn't click on the email that you sent to me, right? So much has changed so quickly. And I'm glad that Adam brought up training because I was just joking with someone else. I'm working on a training program myself, actually. And I've been to so many computer security conferences, and 5 days go by full of whiz-bang software and really complicated encryption techniques and all of this. And if someone gives a speech at the end, and they always say, and the weak link is your employees. Thanks, everybody. See you next year. And that's all that happens. Yeah. And in truth, all the mistakes come down to the least trained employee you have at your company. And, almost every breach, you hear a story of a mistake made by someone. And we're all dependent on each other's security. We're all dependent on each other's cyber habits, our cyber hygiene. And I still feel like companies don't spend nearly enough money on making sure that everyone is up to speed, that everyone has that muscle memory that Adam talked about. I think that's absolutely critical. One of the mistakes we make over and over again is thinking that technology is going to solve all problems, that we can write a check, install a piece of software, and walk away. There's some sort of bias in this industry toward that. And we know that's not the case. We know human beings have to solve this. And it's your human capital that requires the investment to fix this.
Well, and Gary,
I just want to build on something he's saying right now, because there is data that I happen to have bumped into when I first started listening and learning about cybersecurity just a couple years ago. I went to look up the industry, and in the top 500 of the top 500 cybersecurity firms ranked by revenue, only 3% offered any type of training or education, which was 16 companies out of the 500. And I went, oh, okay. But then I started over the last couple of years learning, going to these conferences that you spoke of, and everybody does just what you're doing. At RSA, there were I don't know, 400 or 500 exhibitors, maybe more. When, it just seems like there's this complete misallocation of resources to where the problem is. Adam?
Well, no, that's true. That's true. I mean, you need the technology to help, but at the end of the day, I've talked to a lot of people and they go, we are making incredible progress. Our anti-phishing training program, 80% of the people don't click on the link. And you go,
Right.
it's not even a question of the 20%. All you need is one, the power of one. And that's why organizations can do everything right. And they can even train people, but somebody makes a mistake. And when people are working at home, sharing devices with their kids, which they should not be, this is one where you may do everything right. And when you're not looking, your 7-year-old is on the device and all of a sudden you're in a world of pain. That's why, I suggest to a lot of companies, you should be supplying the devices that your people use if they're working remotely. It's not a cheap date, but it's a heck of a lot cheaper than paying the cost of a breach. Supply the technology, supply the devices, make sure that it meets your software requirements in terms of security, and continue to train people. And cybersecurity, it's a marathon. It has to be a daily conversation, not something that comes in the manual when you get your job and then a year from now you get a refresher course. This has got to be part of everybody's conversation. Companies have to build a culture of privacy and security, from the mailroom to the boardroom, and now in the world we live in, from someone's private living room into the boardroom of a corporation.
Yeah,
It's not an easy thing to do.
yeah. Bob, tell our audience a little bit about the program that you're developing. You have a new training program. Who's the target market
Well,
for it? Or
it's too early to tell you about it.
I was going for my first ever scoop.
Stay tuned. Yeah, no, it's part of a book project that I have ongoing, and I'm going to have a training element with it. And suffice to say, it addresses what I talked about, like the weakest link, the human element, and how best you can make your employees think like they're hackers, because the only way to really understand who your adversary is, the only way to really understand who's attacking you is to put spend a day in the shoes of your adversary. So stay tuned on that. I'll get back to you.
Do I have a scoop?
I would say that's a.
Or are you going to go with some low life like the Wall Street Journal?
I think you already have a good teaser there, no?
Yeah.
It's interesting. We completely have that in common. I mean, for our audience, those of you who do not know my story, I was the victim of essentially a corporate ID thief, where a right-hand person and some tech people spoofed my company, and they established a fake website. They redirected phone calls to their own phone number. They called my biggest clients saying there was fraud in my data collection operation, and I lost several $1,000,000. So as a result of that, I wanted to learn about cybercrime, and so I bought a book called Cybersecurity for Dummies, the yellow ones with the black stripe. And 10 pages in, I was lost. So let's assume I'm of average intelligence. I had about a 100-person company, a small business, and I was lost. So I decided to create these superhero comics to distill complicated information into something that people can get their heads around. What grade level is your new project or your book going to be written at?
Oh, it's for adults and for corporations, for enterprises.
So fourth grade.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I will say, if anyone I come from a family of teachers, and one thing you learn when you're up in front of a bunch of teenagers is if you haven't said it 17 times, you haven't said it once. So you've got to boil these things down very, very simply for people. Don't be afraid to repeat yourself. If you feel like you're dumbing things down and you're insulting people, you're probably doing it just right.
And so you've written a very interesting book, pre-COVID, that was just released in the end of last year, pertaining to opening up a bar versus, getting an MBA. Now that we have this bizarre reality of bars within our ecosystem, are you going to have to write a new forward or change, the advice you've given? now that it's in print?
Well, I mean, let's hope that within a relatively short amount of time, whatever that means, that bars are back fully operating and Adam and I are sharing happy hours again in person and all that. But there is a new forward to that book about how incredibly quickly bars had to pivot on their business models all around New York City and in many other places in the country right now. Bars are all doing takeout. In Washington, D.C., you can get an orange crush from Duke's Grocer with a straw in it. Now, you can't drink it on the sidewalk, but you drink it as soon as you get home. And they're also making all their revenue from takeout, and they've had to figure out how to do the contactless delivery. And think about it, they did all that in weeks, and so that's a lesson for every business. Like we're living in the middle of a black swan event, the most scary kind. Whatever your plans are, something entirely unexpected might happen and interrupt everything. And you should have a plan for that, just like you should have a plan for a big data breach. Life is all about plan Bs. There should be plan Bs, plan Cs, and plan Ds on your shelf at all times. And the people who succeed and people who even thrive at times like this are the ones who planned ahead of time.
It's interesting you say that because I was recently looking at a park. Now that some restrictions are, loosened, and I saw these parents playing with their children. And I think one of the unintended benefits, if you can call it that, of this experience is parents are being forced to be parents again. And as it pertains to technology, there's almost this reverse learning that's happening where kids are teaching parents. Adam, what do you think about that take?
Well, I have an 8-year-old who's soon to be 8, and he teaches me every day about things that I had no clue. His facility with all things technologically oriented it's great. It also poses a whole set of dangers for kids because of people who wish to take advantage of children who are far advanced and are open. I mean, the wonderful thing about kids and the most dangerous thing about kids is no filters. And so this is where the training has to start, where they can train us in technology. We have to train them on cyber hygiene and to understand what a password is. And 1, 2, 3, 4 is not a password. And my son gets it now, which is very exciting. And my spouse, who's very creative, loves to live life on Instagram. And, in the old days, for example, and this is the way the world has really changed. In the old days, people would write journals, lock them, hide them in the back of their dresser or on top of their closet or under their bed. And if they thought anybody would read it, they would kill themselves. Today, it's Instagram, it's WhatsApp, it's Facebook. This is what people are doing. So the question is, how are we adapting to a world where people are cherishing openness? And especially right now during this crisis, people are desperate for contact. And so they are opening themselves up even more. And they're being victimized even more. So it's really about, as I wrote a book called Swiped a few years ago, and it was really talking about how to protect yourself in a world full of scammers, phishers, and identity thieves. And it's really based on adopting a simple to understand regimen of minimizing risk of exposure, monitoring, and having a plan to manage the damage.
Well, on that note, as we're wrapping up, Bob, is there anything you wanted to amplify or share with our audience that we didn't have a chance to cover in this all too brief time together?
Well, we have covered a lot, but I do really like the premise of your show, which is that there are thousands, tens of thousands of anonymous heroes in cyberspace, keeping us all safe, doing all the things that we would expect, say, a fire inspector to do to keep buildings safe, or a health inspector to do to keep restaurants safe. A lot of times these people are unpopular, they're annoying, but if we didn't have them, we'd be in a whole hill of trouble. So this is my moment to thank them and to thank you for what you're doing.
Oh, yeah, it's a real privilege. Thank you so much. Adam, some final thoughts?
Well, yeah, and following up on what Bob said, and again, we appreciate the invitation. I do, to be here, and I think this has been fun for us and a great experience, is that within the bounds of social distancing, find a way to hug your CISO, your Chief Information Security Officer, because
That's a new T-shirt, Adam.
Hug your CISO. Okay.
yeah, that's it. You can now, Gary, you can do a T-shirt, hug your CISO. But you know, it's
We'll do a
true.
joint venture, the three of us.
There you go. But the important thing is to understand that even though someone's asking you to do something which you as a business, it's like you're going to slow my process down. You're going to complicate things. Now I have to go train everybody. This is the world we live in. We have to do this. That we really have to adopt the attitude that it is about privacy and security and running our companies where this is the core. This is not a bolt-on anymore. This is actually the core of our business. And we, as our friend Ann Kevorkian likes to say, Kevorkian, I always get it. I apologize, Ann, former information and privacy officer of Ontario, is that privacy by design, security by design, and we have to think about that as businesses, as in individuals, and then we have to act on it.
Well, on that note, on behalf of a grateful digital universe, thanks to Bob Sullivan and Adam Levin for their incredible insights and for being real life unsung cyber heroes. And one of the things that I've noticed that's very common within the community with the capital C is they're all, pretty humble. And I really want to give a shout out to two of you and all the people that keep us safe at work, at home, at school. If you have someone that you'd like to nominate to be on our show, just send an email to Gary at cyberheroes with an S, comics with an S.com. And we'd love to talk with them. We'll have some additional information in our show notes for both organizations so that you can get in touch with them with any further questions or comments that you might have. So again, thank you all so much for who you are and what you do.
Thanks, Gary.